The dense canopy of Elithra's sprawling jungle trembled as Commander Kale Varos crashed through, landing hard on the mossy ground. Smoke billowed from the remains of his escape pod, now a smoldering wreck amid the alien flora. His pulse pounded in his ears, and every muscle screamed from the impact, but years of battle-hardened instinct forced him to his feet. His survival knife was already in his hand, his gaze scanning the unfamiliar terrain. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of alien blooms, their petals glowing faintly in the dim light. Above, strange avian creatures shrieked and flitted through the towering trees. Kale grimaced, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. His ship was gone, his crew likely dead, and now he was alone on an uncharted world. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, followed by a pair of luminous yellow eyes. "Of course," Kale muttered, gripping his knife tighter. The creature emerged, a hulking predator with spiked fur and dagger-like fangs. It lunged without warning. Kale sidestepped, slashing across its side, drawing a spray of dark ichor. The beast roared, circling him. Kale's breathing steadied, his mind calculating every move. When it attacked again, he rolled beneath its claws, driving his blade deep into its underbelly. The creature collapsed with a final, guttural snarl. Kale rose slowly, wiping the blade clean on the moss. His reprieve was short-lived. A sudden, piercing sound filled the air. A high-pitched whistle, unnatural and precise. Before he could react, a net of energy crackled around him, constricting his movements. He thrashed, but it was futile. Figures emerged from the foliage, sleek and silent, their metallic armor reflecting the faint bioluminescence of the forest. They were tall, their forms lithe yet powerful. Their skins shimmered like opalescent stone, and their eyes glowed with an eerie light. They moved with an almost supernatural grace, their weapons trained on him. One stepped forward, her stance confident, her gaze appraising. "You're not Void Swarm," she said, her voice cool and sharp, though her lips barely moved. "But you're no ally either." Kale glared, his jaw tightening. "I'm no enemy. Let me go, and I'll prove it." The lead figure tilted her head, her expression one of faint amusement. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, brute." The energy net tightened, forcing Kale to his knees. His captors exchanged silent glances, their communication clearly telepathic. The leader, a warrior with intricate markings across her arms, circled him. "I am Amara of the Seraphine," she said, her voice resonating with authority. "You will answer to our council." Kale clenched his fists, his body straining against the bonds. "And if I refuse?" Amara's lips curled into a smirk. "Then you'll find our mercy is not infinite." Bound and under heavy guard, Kale was marched through the jungle. He took in his surroundings, noting the advanced yet organic architecture of the Seraphine outpost that came into view. Towers of woven silver and crystal rose amidst the trees, their surfaces pulsing with a soft, internal light. Inside the largest structure, Kale was brought before the Seraphine Council. Their leader, Alindra, regarded him with a cold, calculating gaze. "You bring danger to our world, human. Explain yourself." Kale recounted his crash, his voice steady despite their scrutiny. He spoke of the war he fought and the Void Swarm, the galaxy-spanning plague of destruction he had been battling. Mention of the swarm drew a visible reaction. Even the serene Alindra stiffened. "The Void Swarm is no mere enemy," Kale warned. "If they're coming here, you'll need more than your telepathy and fancy armor to survive." A murmur passed through the council. Alindra's expression remained impassive. "Our methods have safeguarded us for centuries. What could one human offer that we cannot achieve on our own?" Kale's gaze hardened. "Tactics, strategy, weapons designed to exploit their weaknesses. I faced them before and lived. Can any of you say the same?" The council deliberated silently. Amara, standing beside Alindra, watched Kale with narrowed eyes. Her skepticism was palpable, but there was a flicker of something else. Curiosity, perhaps. Finally, Alindra spoke. "You will remain under Amara's watch. Prove your worth, human, or your stay here will be brief. Kale was escorted to a chamber, the walls adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to shift and glow under his scrutiny. Amara lingered near the entrance, arms crossed. Don't think for a moment that your presence here is welcome, she said, her tone biting. You may have fooled the council, but I'm not so easily impressed. Kale leaned against the wall, his eyes never leaving hers. I don't care if you're impressed. I care about keeping your people alive. Amara scoffed, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than she intended. Without another word, she turned and left. The next day, Kale was thrust into a training session with the Seraphine warriors. They moved like phantoms, their coordination seamless, their strikes precise. Kale, stripped of his advanced tech, relied on his honed reflexes and physical strength to keep up. Amara observed from the sidelines, her expression inscrutable. When Kale disarmed one of her best fighters with a calculated fate, her eyes narrowed. You rely too much on brute force, she said, stepping into the ring. Let's see how you fare against me. Kale smirked. Gladly, they circled each other, tension crackling in the air. Amara struck first, her speed blinding, but Kale anticipated her move, catching her wrist and twisting her momentum against her. She broke free with a fluid motion, her next strike grazing his side. Their sparring was a dance of clashing styles, his raw power against her refined precision. The match ended in a stalemate, both of them breathing heavily. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and the charged silence between them spoke volumes. Not bad, Amara admitted, a trace of reluctant respect in her voice. But you still have much to learn. Kale chuckled. You're not exactly a pushover yourself. Their exchange was interrupted by a piercing alarm. A scout burst into the chamber, her expression grim. The Void Swarm, she said urgently. They're here. Kale and Amara exchanged a look, the weight of the impending threat settling between them. The Void Swarm descended on the outskirts of the Seraphine settlement with ruthless precision. Tendrils of shadow-like creatures slithered through the jungle, consuming everything in their path. The Seraphine warriors mobilized swiftly, their crystalline weapons humming with energy. Despite their elegance, the air was tense with uncertainty. The Void Swarm was a foe unlike any they had faced before. Kale stood at the edge of the command platform, scanning the advancing swarm. Beside him, Amara issued orders telepathically, her voice calm but sharp. The Seraphine formations moved in perfect sync, their precision honed through generations of battle. Still, Kale could see the cracks forming. The Void Swarm's relentless advance was throwing their coordination into disarray. They're too reactive, Kale muttered. You're waiting for them to dictate the fight. Amara's eyes flicked to him, her irritation evident. Our tactics have kept us safe for centuries. You may have fought them before, but this is our world. Your world won't last another day if you don't adapt. Kale shot back, his tone harsh but urgent. Let me lead a counteroffensive. I can buy you time to regroup. Amara hesitated, her pride clashing with the undeniable truth in his words. Finally, she nodded. You'll have your chance, human. Don't waste it. Kale moved swiftly, rallying a smaller contingent of Seraphine warriors. He laid out a simple but aggressive plan, using the terrain to funnel the swarm into choke points where their numbers would count for less. The warriors exchanged skeptical glances but followed his lead. As the battle raged, Kale's tactics proved effective. The Void Swarm, driven by mindless hunger, faltered under the coordinated assault. Kale fought at the forefront, his blade cutting through the creatures with brutal efficiency. Amara observed from a distance, her expression unreadable. When the dust settled, the swarm had been pushed back, though at a cost. The Seraphine warriors were weary, their ranks thinned. Kale returned to the command platform, his armor stained with ichor. Amara stood waiting, her arms crossed. You were right, she admitted reluctantly. But this is far from over. Kale nodded, his expression grim. This was just a scouting force. The real attack is coming. The council convened once more, their demeanor more somber than before. Alindra addressed Kale directly. Your tactics have bought us time, but the Void Matriarch will not be so easily deterred. We must prepare for the final assault. Amara glanced at Kale, her gaze softer than before. We'll need to unite the other clans. Some have refused to join the fight, fearing the cost. I'll go, Kale said immediately. But I'll need someone who knows the terrain. Someone the other clans will trust. All eyes turned to Amara. She sighed but didn't argue. Fine. But if you slow me down, I'm leaving you behind. Their journey took them deep into the uncharted regions of Elithra, where the jungle grew thicker and the air heavier. The tension between Kale and Amara was palpable. They spoke little, their exchanges limited to tactical discussions. Yet, the silence between them was charged, each aware of the other's presence in a way that went beyond simple proximity. As night fell, they set up camp in a secluded glade. The faint glow of the bioluminescent plants bathed the area in an eerie light. Amara sat by the fire, her gaze distant. You fight well, she said finally, her tone more contemplative than before. But you're reckless. Gaib shrugged. Recklessness has kept me alive this long. Amara's lips twitched in a faint smile. Perhaps. But if you're going to lead, you'll need to think beyond survival. Kale studied her for a moment. You don't trust me. I trust your skills, Amara admitted. But trust is earned, not given. Silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of the fire. After a while, Kale spoke, his voice quieter. Why do you stay? You could have let the council send someone else. Amara hesitated, her gaze dropping to the flames. Because I've seen what the Void Swarm can do. I've seen them tear through our defenses like they were nothing. If there's even a chance that you can help us, I'll take it. Her vulnerability surprised Kale. He moved closer, their shoulders nearly touching. We'll stop them, he said with quiet determination. Together. Amara looked at him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. Together, she echoed. The warmth between them grew as the night wore on. At one point, Kale reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Amara didn't pull away. Instead, she turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his. In that moment, words felt unnecessary. Slowly, cautiously, Kale leaned in. Their lips met in a tentative kiss. A meeting of two warriors finding solace in each other. The kiss deepened, their tension melting away as they surrendered to the moment. When they finally pulled apart, they sat in silence, the bond between them stronger than before. The next morning, they continued their journey with renewed purpose. Their path led them to a fortified village hidden within the cliffs. The clan leader, a stern warrior named Teva, greeted them with suspicion. We've heard of the Void Swarm, Teva said, her gaze hard. But we will not sacrifice our people for a war we cannot win. Kale stepped forward, his voice steady. If you don't fight, there won't be a village left to protect. I've seen what they do to worlds like yours. They'll consume everything. Teva's eyes flicked to Amara, seeking confirmation. Amara nodded. He speaks the truth, and he's proven himself in battle. After a tense negotiation, Teva agreed to send warriors to join the fight. As Kale and Amara prepared to leave, Teva pulled Amara aside. Be careful with him, Teva warned. The bond you're forming is dangerous. Could make you vulnerable. Amara's expression hardened. I know the risks, but I also know what's at stake. As they departed, Kale noticed the shift in Amara's demeanor. What did she say? Nothing I don't already know, Amara replied, her voice steady. Let's focus on the mission. Kale didn't press further. They had a war to win, and the Void Matriarch was still out there, waiting. The jungle was alive with tension as Kale and Amara led their newly assembled coalition of Seraphine warriors through the dense, glowing underbrush. The once fractured clans had finally united under the threat of annihilation, but unease lingered in the air. Every warrior knew the stakes. This was no mere skirmish. The Void Swarm's full force loomed just beyond the horizon. Kale felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had been in countless battles, faced enemies that defied logic, but this was different. The Seraphine were placing their trust in an outsider, a human they had once scorned. He glanced at Amara, her expression stoic as she silently guided the group. Despite her composed exterior, Kale knew she felt the same pressure. Their bond had deepened over the past days, an unspoken understanding growing between them. They didn't need words to communicate now. A single look conveyed everything. As they approached a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of the jungle, Kale raised a hand, signaling the group to halt. Amara stepped up beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, a dark, writhing mass moved like a living storm, the Void Swarm. Their grotesque forms melded and shifted, their eerie, unnatural cries echoing through the valleys below. "They're gathering for the final push," Kale said, his voice low but firm. Amara nodded, her jaw tightening. "This will be our last stand. If we fail here—" "We won't," Kale interrupted, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We'll hit them hard and fast, disrupt their momentum. You've seen what we can do when we work together." Amara's gaze softened for a moment as she looked at him. "You've given my people something we thought we'd lost, hope. But that hope rests on you, Kale. On us." Kale reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was brief but electric, a reminder of the connection they shared. "I won't let you down," he said quietly. They spent the next hours preparing for the battle. Kale walked among the warriors, offering words of encouragement and tactical advice. The Seraphine listened intently, their initial skepticism replaced by determination. Amara, too, moved among them, her presence a steadying force. Together, they formed the heart of this united front, their bond a symbol of the strength that could be found in unity. As night fell, the jungle was bathed in an eerie glow from the bioluminescent plants. The Seraphine warriors stood ready, their crystalline weapons gleaming in the dim light. Kale donned his armor, the once familiar weight grounding him in the moment. Amara approached, her own armor glinting softly. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice steady but with an undertone of concern. Kale nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Always." Amara stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "Kale, if something happens to me out there—" "Don't," Kale interrupted, his voice firm. "We both make it out of this. No other outcome." She held his gaze for a long moment before leaning in, their foreheads touching. The intimacy of the gesture was grounding, a silent promise between them. Kale felt the weight of her trust and the strength of her resolve. The quiet moment was shattered by the distant roar of the Void Swarm. The ground trembled beneath them as the dark mass surged forward, a tide of destruction moving with terrifying speed. Kale and Amara broke apart, their focus snapping back to the battle at hand. Kale raised his blade, its edge gleaming with a faint blue light. "For Elithra!" he shouted, his voice carrying over the gathered warriors. "For Elithra!" The Seraphine echoed, their voices a unified roar. The battle erupted with ferocious intensity. The Void Swarm crashed against the Seraphine lines like a living tsunami, their monstrous forms clawing and slashing. Kale fought at the front, his blade a blur as he cut through the swarm. Each strike was precise, each movement efficient. The Seraphine warriors fought with equal ferocity, their telepathic coordination allowing them to move as one. Amara was a whirlwind of grace and deadly precision, her twin blades slicing through the enemy with fluid elegance. She and Kale fought back to back, their movements perfectly synchronized. Every time one of them faltered, the other was there to cover, their bond an unbreakable shield against the chaos. Despite their efforts, the Void Swarm was relentless. For every creature they felled, more took its place. The battle raged on, the tide of darkness threatening to overwhelm them. Kale's muscles burned, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, but he pushed on. He caught sight of Amara struggling against a particularly large beast, its massive claws closing in on her. With a surge of adrenaline, Kale threw himself between them, driving his blade into the creature's maw. It let out a guttural screech before collapsing. Kale turned to Amara, their eyes meeting in a moment of unspoken gratitude and resolve. The ground beneath them suddenly erupted, a massive rift splitting the battlefield. From the depths emerged the Void Matriarch, her form towering and grotesque, an amalgamation of shadow and bone. Her eyes burned with malevolent intelligence as she let out a deafening roar. The battlefield seemed to pause for a heartbeat, the sheer presence of the matriarch sending a wave of fear through the Seraphine ranks. Kale stepped forward, his grip tightening on his blade. "This ends now," he growled. Amara moved to his side, her expression fierce. Together, the matriarch's tendrils lashed out, forcing Kale and Amara to dodge and weave. They struck in unison, their attacks coordinated and relentless. The matriarch shrieked, her form shifting and writhing as she retaliated. Every blow they landed seemed to weaken her, but the cost was high. The Seraphine lines were faltering, their warriors pushed to the brink. Kale felt a sharp pain as one of the matriarch's tendrils grazed his side, but he didn't falter. Amara moved to cover him, her blades slicing through the tendrils with precision. They pressed on, their bond the only thing keeping them going. Finally, they saw their chance. The matriarch reared back, exposing a vulnerable core pulsing with dark energy. Kale and Amara exchanged a quick glance, their silent communication clear. With a final surge of strength, they struck as one, their combined power driving their blades into the core. The matriarch let out an earth-shattering scream as her form began to disintegrate. The remaining void swarm creatures convulsed and collapsed, their connection to their queen severed. The battlefield fell silent, the oppressive weight of the swarm lifting. Kale and Amara stood together, breathing heavily, their weapons still in hand. Around them, the surviving Seraphine warriors began to cheer, their cries of victory echoing through the jungle. Kale turned to Amara, his expression a mix of exhaustion and relief. "We did it." Amara smiled, her eyes bright. "Together." But even as the victory settled in, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The void had been pushed back, but its darkness lingered, a reminder of the battles yet to come. The aftermath of the battle brought a tense, somber quiet to the Seraphine camp. The Void Matriarch was defeated, but the toll was heavy. Bodies of fallen warriors were carefully gathered, their faces serene in death, and the wounded were tended with quiet efficiency. Kale moved through the camp, his presence a strange mixture of commanding and distant. The Seraphine warriors who had once viewed him with suspicion now acknowledged him with nods of respect, yet he found no comfort in their silent approval. Amara stood near the edge of the camp, her sharp gaze fixed on the horizon. Her armor was dented and smeared with dark ichor, her movements slower from the wounds she refused to let anyone see. Kale approached, his footsteps deliberate, but she didn't turn to acknowledge him. "We held them off," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady but laced with exhaustion. "For now." Amara finally glanced his way, her expression unreadable. "The matriarch's death bought us time. But the void doesn't stop. It never stops." Kale exhaled heavily and sat on a fallen log beside her. "We'll be ready. We have to be." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The jungle around them was alive with its usual hum of strange creatures and glowing flora, but it felt muted, as though the planet itself was catching its breath. Kale looked at Amara, noting the tension in her posture. "You should rest," he said. "You're hurt." "I'm fine," Amara replied, her tone sharp but not unkind. She paused, then added, "The others need me." "They need you alive," Kale countered, his voice softening. "You don't have to carry this alone." Amara's eyes met his, and for the first time that day, her stoic facade cracked. There was a vulnerability there, buried beneath layers of responsibility and pride. Kale reached out, his hand brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. "I've never trusted anyone like this," Amara admitted quietly, her voice barely audible over the ambient sounds of the jungle. "Not with my people. Not with myself." Kale's fingers tightened slightly around hers. "You don't have to say it," he said gently. "I'm here." Amara leaned in slightly, her shoulder touching his. They sat in silence, drawing strength from the shared closeness. The connection between them had grown beyond words, a bond forged in battle and tempered by the weight of their shared burden. Kale could feel her heartbeat, steady and strong, as though it echoed his own. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Kale and Amara pulled apart, their masks of command slipping back into place as Lysara, one of Amara's most vocal rivals, approached. Her sharp features were set in a frown, and her armor gleamed as if she hadn't seen a single blow in the battle. Amara, Lysara said, her tone curt. The council wishes to speak with you. They're convening now. Amara rose smoothly, her composure fully restored. I'll be there shortly. Lysara's eyes flicked to Kale, her disapproval evident. She didn't say anything, but her gaze spoke volumes before she turned and left. She doesn't like me much, Kale remarked, standing as well. She doesn't like anyone she can't control, Amara replied. Her voice carried a faint edge of amusement. Don't take it personally. Kale smirked, but the moment was fleeting. Go, he said. I'll keep an eye on things here. Amara nodded and left without another word, her form disappearing into the heart of the camp. Kale watched her go, a gnawing sense of unease settling in his chest. He knew their victory against the matriarch was a fragile one, and the unity of the Seraphim clans was even more tenuous. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was heavy. The elders sat in a semicircle, their expressions grim. Amara stood before them, her chin held high, but the weight of their collective gaze was oppressive. Your efforts have been commendable, Elindra began, her voice calm but authoritative. But we must address the growing concerns. Concerns? Amara asked, though she already knew where this was going. Your bond with the human. Another elder, Thales, said bluntly. It is unconventional. It has also saved us, Amara replied, her tone steady. Without Kale, we wouldn't have survived the matriarch's attack. Elindra raised a hand, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the council. No one denies his contributions, but the nature of your connection poses risks. The void thrives on emotional bonds, and the deeper yours grows, the more vulnerable you both become. Amara clenched her fists at her sides. We've already proven that our bond is a strength, not a weakness. It allows us to fight as one. And if the void turns that strength against you, Thales countered, if it corrupts your connection, it could destroy not only you but everyone who depends on you. Amara's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She understood their fear, even if she didn't share it. Her connection with Kale was unlike anything she had ever known, and while it frightened her, it also gave her hope. She wasn't ready to let that go. Elindra's voice softened. We ask only that you remain vigilant. The decisions you make now will shape the future of Elithra. Amara nodded, though her mind was already racing. She left the chamber with a heavy heart, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Kale was waiting for her when she returned. He stood near the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the dark jungle as if searching for unseen threats. When he saw her, his expression softened. Bad news? He asked. Amara sighed. The council is worried about us. They think our bond makes us a liability. Kale crossed his arms, his expression hardening. They don't trust me. They trust you more than they used to, Amara said. But this isn't just about you. It's about what we've become together. Kale stepped closer, his gaze intense. And what do you think? Amara hesitated, her heart pounding. I think they're wrong. I think what we have is the reason we're still standing. Kale reached for her, his hand cupping her cheek. The touch was gentle, grounding her in the moment. Then we'll prove it to them. Together. Amara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. For all the uncertainty that lay ahead, this was something she could hold on to. Their bond was more than a strategy, more than a weapon. It was hope, and she wouldn't let it slip away. The night deepened, and though the jungle around them was alive with unseen dangers, Kale and Amara stood firm. The fight was far from over, but for now, they found strength in each other. And as the stars above Elithra shimmered faintly through the canopy, They prepared for the battles yet to come. The Seraphim camp had settled into a restless calm after the council's warnings. Warriors continued to train, their focus sharpening as they prepared for the next inevitable clash with the remnants of the Void Swarm. The jungle buzzed with activity, its vibrant life a stark contrast to the weight hanging over the camp. Kale stood near the perimeter, watching the treeline. His grip tightened around the hilt of his blade, more out of habit than necessity. The battle against the matriarch had left scars on all of them, but it was the unspoken tension with Amara that lingered most in his mind. He could sense her even before she approached, her presence a steady pulse that matched his own. "You've been staring at the jungle for hours," Amara said as she came to stand beside him. Her voice was steady, but there was a softness in it that hadn't been there before. Kale glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, folding her arms. Kale hesitated. "The void isn't done with us. You know that as well as I do." Amara nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I know. The council's warnings don't help either. They're afraid of what we've built." "They're afraid because they don't understand it," Kale said. "But that doesn't mean they're wrong." Amara turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Do you think we're vulnerable?" Kale's jaw clenched. "I think we've tapped into something powerful. But power like that always comes with risks." Amara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "And do you regret it?" Kale reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "Not for a second." Their bond had become more than a tactical advantage. It was a lifeline, an anchor in the storm. They had tested its limits in battle, their connection allowing them to move as one, anticipating each other's actions with uncanny precision. But now, in the stillness of the camp, it was something more intimate, a connection that went beyond words or gestures. Amara hesitated, then placed her hand on his chest, just over his heart. "I can feel it," she said quietly. "Even now. Your heartbeat. It's steady, strong." Kale covered her hand with his, their touch a silent affirmation of what they had become. "And I can feel yours," he replied. "It keeps me grounded." For a moment, the weight of their responsibilities fell away. They stood together, the jungle around them fading into the background. The warmth of Amara's touch, the steadiness of her presence, was enough to remind Kale why they fought. The moment was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps. One of the Seraphine scouts, a young warrior named Talia, approached, her expression urgent. "Amara, Kale," she said, her voice breathless. "The Void Swarm. It's regrouping. We've spotted movement in the northern sector." Kale and Amara exchanged a look, their shared connection sparking with renewed purpose. Without a word, they followed Talia to the command center, where a group of warriors had gathered around a glowing map. Elindra stood at the center, her calm demeanor belying the gravity of the situation. She acknowledged Kale and Amara with a nod as they joined the group. "The Void forces are rallying here," Elindra said, pointing to a dense section of jungle. "If they consolidate their strength, they'll overwhelm us in the next assault." Kale studied the map, his mind already working through possible strategies. "We need to hit them before they're ready. A preemptive strike could break their momentum." Amara nodded. "Agreed. But we'll need to move quickly. If we wait too long, they'll be too entrenched." Elindra considered their words, then gave a decisive nod. "You'll lead the strike force. Choose your warriors and move out immediately." Within minutes, Kale and Amara had assembled a team of the most skilled fighters. As they prepared to leave, Kale could feel the tension in the air, a mixture of anticipation and determination. Amara stood beside him, her expression fierce. "We'll finish this," she said quietly. Kale nodded, his resolve matching hers. Together, the journey to the northern sector was swift but perilous. The jungle seemed to close in around them, its once beautiful glow now casting eerie shadows. The team moved with practiced stealth, their every step carefully calculated. Kale could feel the weight of their trust, and it only strengthened his resolve. As they neared the Void's position, the air grew colder, an unnatural chill that set every nerve on edge. They came to a halt just outside a clearing, where the enemy forces were gathered. The sight was both horrifying and awe-inspiring. The void creatures moved with a terrible purpose, their forms shifting and writhing as they prepared for their next attack. Kale turned to the team, his voice low but firm. "We hit them hard and fast. Disrupt their formation and force them into chaos. Stick to the plan and we'll make it out." The warriors nodded, their expressions grim but determined. Amara placed a hand on Kale's arm, her touch grounding him once more. "We've got this," she said. With a final nod, Kale gave the signal, and the strike force moved into action. The battle was immediate and intense, the clash of weapons and the roars of the void creatures filling the air. Kale and Amara fought side by side, their bond once again guiding their every move. They struck with precision, each attack calculated to maximize damage and sow confusion among the enemy ranks. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Seraphim warriors held their ground. The void forces, caught off guard, faltered under the relentless assault. Kale could feel the tide turning, their strategy working as planned. But the void was never without its tricks. As the battle raged on, a new figure emerged from the shadows. A void lieutenant, its form larger and more menacing than any they had faced before. Its eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence, and its voice was a low, guttural growl. "Your bond will be your undoing," it snarled, its gaze fixed on Kale and Amara. The lieutenant charged, its attacks swift and brutal. Kale and Amara moved together, their connection pushing them beyond their limits. They dodged and countered, their strikes landing with deadly precision. But the creature was relentless, its strength fueled by the void's dark energy. In a final, desperate move, Kale and Amara combined their efforts, their attacks converging on the creature's core. With a deafening roar, the lieutenant fell, its form dissolving into the shadows. As the remaining void forces retreated, Kale and Amara stood together, their breaths ragged but victorious. The battle was won, but they knew the war was far from over. Kale looked at Amara, his eyes filled with both exhaustion and determination. "We'll face whatever comes next," he said. Amara nodded, her hand finding his. Together, the victory against the Void Lieutenant brought a brief sense of relief to the Seraphim camp, but it was short-lived. The council reconvened the next morning, their expressions more somber than ever. Amara stood in the center of the chamber, her armor still bearing the marks of the recent battle, while Kale lingered near the entrance, his stance tense. Elindra's voice was calm but firm as she addressed them. "The Void's retreat is temporary. Their leader may have fallen, but their forces remain a threat." Kale stepped forward, his tone resolute. "We've proven we can break their lines. We'll do it again." Thales, the council's most vocal skeptic, narrowed her eyes. "Your methods are effective, but they come with a cost. The Void is drawn to your bond, exploiting it to gain strength." Amara's gaze flicked to Kale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Our bond is what allowed us to succeed." "Success at what price?" Thales retorted. "The Void feeds on emotional connections. Every time you and the human fight together, you risk drawing them closer." Elindra raised a hand to silence the growing tension. "This is not a decision we take lightly, but for the safety of our people, we must consider all options." Kale's fists clenched at his sides. "What are you saying?" Elindra's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "You must leave, Commander Kale. The bond you share with Amara is too dangerous. If the Void turns it against us, it could mean the end of Elithra." The chamber fell silent. Amara's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of the council's decision crashing down on her. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You can't be serious. Kale has risked everything for us. He's proven his loyalty time and again." "This is not about loyalty," Elindra said gently. "It is about survival." Kale's voice was quiet but laced with steel. "If leaving is what it takes to protect your people, I'll go." Amara turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Kale, no." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her even as her emotions threatened to spiral out of control. Amara, they're right. The void is still out there, and if staying puts everyone at risk, then I have to do this. Amara's throat tightened, but she didn't argue. The council watched silently as Kale and Amara exchanged a final look, their bond unspoken but undeniable. Without another word, Kale turned and left the chamber. The camp was unusually quiet as Kale prepared to leave. The warriors who had fought beside him offered respectful nods but kept their distance, their loyalty to their leaders outweighing their personal feelings. Kale gathered his gear, his movements methodical, but his mind was far from calm. Amara found him near the edge of the camp, her expression a mix of anger and sorrow. "You're really going to walk away?" Kale stopped, his hands tightening around the straps of his pack. "It's the only way to keep the void from using us against them." "Against us?" Amara corrected, stepping closer. "They're asking you to sacrifice everything we've built." Kale met her gaze, his eyes filled with regret. "And if staying means putting you in danger, I can't do it. You know that." Amara reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. "I don't care about the risks. I care about you." Kale's hand covered hers, his grip firm but tender. "Amara, this isn't goodbye. I'll find another way to fight. We'll find a way back to each other." The intensity of their connection surged, an unspoken promise passing between them. Amara leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both desperate and fierce. It was a moment of raw emotion, a final defiance against the forces pulling them apart. When they broke apart, Amara's voice was a whisper. "Be safe, Kale." Kale nodded, his resolve hardening. "You too." With a final glance, Kale turned and disappeared into the jungle, leaving Amara standing alone at the edge of the camp. The weight of his absence settled over her like a storm cloud, but she refused to let it break her. Days passed, and the camp returned to its routine, but Amara felt the emptiness left by Kale's departure. She threw herself into her duties, leading training sessions and fortifying defenses, but the bond they shared lingered in her mind. She could still feel him, a faint presence that refused to fade. One night, as Amara sat alone in her quarters, a familiar chill crept into the air. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and a low, sinister voice echoed in her mind. "You cannot hide from us, Amara." Amara's heart raced as the voice of the Void Matriarch filled her thoughts. She gritted her teeth, focusing on her breathing to push the intrusion away, but the presence only grew stronger. "Your bond with the human is a weakness," the voice hissed, "and we will use it to destroy you." Amara shot to her feet, her hands clenched into fists. "You won't break me." The shadows coalesced, forming a spectral image of the matriarch. Its glowing eyes burned with malice as it sneered. "You already belong to us." Before Amara could react, the apparition vanished, leaving her alone in the dimly lit room. She sank onto the edge of her bed, her mind racing. The void's reach was growing, and their connection to her and Kale was stronger than she had feared. The next morning, Amara called a meeting with Alindra and the council. She recounted the matriarch's intrusion, her voice steady despite the growing sense of urgency. "They're not done with us," Amara said, "and Kale's absence won't change that." Alindra's expression darkened. "The void will not rest until they have consumed everything. Then we have to find a way to sever their connection to us," Amara said. "Permanently." The council exchanged wary glances, but Alindra nodded. "We will explore every option. For now, we must strengthen our defenses and prepare for their return." As the council dispersed, Amara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, and though Kale was no longer by her side, she knew their bond remained a powerful force. She would fight to protect Elithra, and to find her way back to him no matter the cost. Kale moved through the dense jungle, his body on high alert as the alien foliage shifted and pulsed around him. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from physical exhaustion, but from the weight of separation. Days had turned into weeks since he left the Seraphine camp, but the bond he shared with Amara hadn't faded. It was a constant pulse at the edge of his mind, a tether that kept her close despite the distance. The jungle's quiet was deceptive, broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Kale's hand rested on the hilt of his blade as he scanned the shadows. He was heading toward a rumored ruin, a place the Seraphine had spoken of in hushed tones, a relic of their ancestors said to hold ancient knowledge. If there was any chance of finding a way to sever the void's hold on their bond, it would be there. As he pressed on, a sudden ripple of cold shot down his spine. His connection to Amara flared, a sharp jolt of fear and urgency passing through him. Kale froze, his heart pounding. "Amara," he whispered, his grip tightening on his weapon. He closed his eyes, focusing on the bond. Images flashed through his mind. Amara standing amidst swirling shadows, her blades drawn, her face set in grim determination. The void was attacking again, and she was in the thick of it. Kale cursed under his breath, the pull to return to her almost overwhelming. But he knew his mission was just as critical. If he couldn't find a solution here, their bond would remain a beacon for the void's relentless onslaught. Pushing the connection to the back of his mind, Kale continued, his pace quickening. The jungle gradually gave way to a clearing, where towering stone structures jutted out of the earth like the bones of a long-dead giant. The ruins were covered in vines, their surfaces etched with ancient Seraphine symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. Kale approached cautiously, his eyes scanning for any signs of danger. As he stepped into the central courtyard, a deep hum resonated through the air, the ground beneath him vibrating. He paused, his senses on high alert. "You seek the wisdom of the ancients," a voice echoed, low and melodic, yet filled with an otherworldly presence. Kale turned, his blade at the ready, but he saw no one. The voice seemed to emanate from the ruins themselves. "I seek a way to break the void's connection," Kale said, his voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "To protect the Seraphine, to protect Amara." The hum deepened, and the symbols on the stone began to glow brighter. "Your bond with the Seraphine warrior is unique. It is both your greatest strength and your greatest vulnerability." Kale clenched his jaw. "Then tell me how to protect it." The air around him grew colder, the light from the symbols pulsing rhythmically. "The bond you share is forged in unity, but the void thrives on division. To sever its influence, you must strengthen your connection beyond the physical, beyond the emotional." Kale frowned. "What does that mean?" A faint shimmer appeared in the center of the courtyard, coalescing into a spectral figure. It was tall and ethereal, its features indistinct but unmistakably Seraphine. The figure extended a hand, and a glowing orb materialized in its palm. "Enter the convergence," the figure said. "If your bond is true, you will emerge stronger. But be warned, the void will not sit idle." Kale stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the orb. He could feel its energy pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Without hesitation, he reached out, his fingers brushing the surface. The world around him dissolved in a burst of light. Amara fought with everything she had, her blades a blur as they cut through the void creatures swarming the Seraphine defenses. The battle was chaos, the air thick with the stench of the enemy's ichor and the cries of wounded warriors. Despite their best efforts, the void's numbers seemed endless. Her connection to Kale burned at the back of her mind, a constant reminder of his absence. She had tried to focus on the fight, but the bond pulled at her, filling her with a mix of determination and longing. Every time she faltered, she could almost hear his voice urging her on. A particularly large void beast lunged at her, its claws aimed for her chest. Amara twisted out of the way, her blade slicing through its arm. Before it could recover, she drove her second blade into its core, the creature dissolving into shadowy mist. As she caught her breath, a sudden wave of cold washed over her, more intense than anything she had felt before. The battlefield seemed to shift, the edges of her vision blurring. She could feel the void pressing in on her mind, its voice a low, insidious whisper. "You cannot fight us forever," it hissed. "Your bond will be your undoing." Amara gritted her teeth, pushing back against the intrusion. "You're wrong." But the void's presence only grew stronger, wrapping around her like a suffocating shroud. In that moment, She felt Kale more clearly than ever, their connection flaring with an intensity that left her breathless. She closed her eyes, focusing on the bond, drawing strength from it. Suddenly, a surge of warmth flooded through her, cutting through the void's cold grip. She opened her eyes to see a burst of light in the distance, illuminating the battlefield. The void creatures recoiled, their forms flickering as the light grew brighter. Amara's heart leapt as she recognized the energy. "Kale," she whispered. The light converged, forming a shield around the Seraphine forces. The void creatures screeched and retreated, their forms dissolving into the shadows. In the midst of the chaos, Amara felt Kale's presence, stronger than ever. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, hope burned brightly in her chest. Kale emerged from the convergence, his body and mind pulsing with newfound energy. The bond with Amara had deepened, solidified in a way he hadn't thought possible. He could feel her presence as if she were standing right beside him, their connection a beacon of light against the void's darkness. He didn't have time to question the experience. The moment his surroundings solidified, he was on the move, his steps guided by the pull of their bond. The jungle blurred around him as he raced toward the Seraphine camp. When he arrived, the battlefield was a scene of devastation, but the Seraphine held their ground. Kale spotted Amara at the center of the fight, her blades flashing as she cut down the remaining void creatures. Without hesitation, he joined her, their movements perfectly synchronized. The tide of the battle shifted as the void forces began to falter. Together, Kale and Amara drove them back, their bond radiating a strength that the enemy couldn't penetrate. Within moments, the void creatures retreated, disappearing into the jungle's shadows. As the dust settled, Kale turned to Amara, their eyes meeting across the battlefield. Without a word, they closed the distance between them, their hands finding each other in a moment of quiet relief. "We're stronger together," Kale said, his voice steady. Amara nodded, a fierce determination in her gaze. "And we'll face whatever comes next. Together." The Seraphine camp braced itself for the final confrontation. Despite their recent victory, everyone knew the Void Swarm was far from defeated. Scouts reported that the Void's forces were regrouping near the ruins of an ancient Seraphine stronghold, where the energy of the planet's lifeblood pulsed strongest. It was clear the Void was preparing for a last, devastating assault. Kale stood with Amara at the center of the War Council, their bond now a visible strength that bolstered those around them. His presence, once met with skepticism, now commanded respect. The warriors gathered leaned in as he laid out the plan. "They'll focus their attack here," Kale said, pointing to a narrow gorge leading to the stronghold. "It's their only viable route, but it also makes them vulnerable. If we can hold this line, we can force them into a bottleneck and pick them off." Amara nodded, her voice calm but firm. "We'll split our forces. A smaller team will infiltrate the stronghold from behind and disrupt their command center. Without direction, the swarm will fall into chaos." Alindra, standing at the head of the table, crossed her arms. "You'll lead the infiltration team?" "I will," Amara confirmed. "And Kale will command the front line." The council murmured in agreement. Alindra's sharp gaze shifted to Kale. "This will be our last stand. If we fail, Elithra falls." Kale met her eyes, his resolve unshakable. "We won't fail." As the first light of dawn broke through the jungle canopy, the Seraphine forces moved into position. Kale stood at the head of the main battalion, his armor gleaming faintly in the dim light. The warriors around him moved with precision, their crystalline weapons humming softly as they prepared for the inevitable clash. Amara approached, her own team of elite fighters assembled behind her. She placed a hand on Kale's shoulder, her touch grounding him as much as it did her. "This is it," she said quietly. Kale turned to her, his expression softening. "We've come this far. Whatever happens, we face it together." Amara hesitated for a moment, then leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. It was a gesture of trust and connection, one that spoke volumes without words. They stood like that for a few heartbeats before Amara pulled away. "Stay alive," she said, her tone both a command and a plea. You too, Kale replied. With one last glance, Amara led her team into the jungle, disappearing into the shadows. Kale watched her go, his heart heavy but his focus razor-sharp. He turned back to his warriors, raising his blade. Hold the line, he commanded. We fight for Elithra. A roar of determination rose from the Seraphine warriors as they took their positions. Moments later, the ground began to tremble, and a low, guttural hum filled the air. The void swarm was coming. Dark figures emerged from the jungle, their grotesque forms twisting and writhing as they moved. The swarm surged forward like a living tide, their screams echoing through the gorge. Kale's voice rang out above the chaos. Hold your ground. The first wave of void creatures crashed against the Seraphine defenses. Kale fought at the forefront, his blade a blur as he cut through the enemy. The warriors beside him moved in perfect unison, their strikes precise and deadly. Despite the swarm's overwhelming numbers, the Seraphine held firm. Kale's mind remained sharp, his connection to Amara a constant presence. He could feel her determination, her focus, as her team infiltrated the stronghold. Every now and then, a flicker of her thoughts reached him, a brief but comforting reminder that she was still fighting. But the void was relentless. For every creature they felled, more took its place. The battle raged on, the line of defense bending but never breaking. Kale's muscles burned, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't falter. He couldn't. Suddenly, a deafening roar split the air, and the ground beneath them shook violently. From the depths of the gorge emerged a massive void beast, its form towering and grotesque, its eyes burning with malevolent light. It was a harbinger of destruction, a creature born from the darkest depths of the void. Kale's heart pounded as the beast advanced, its every step shaking the earth. He knew this was the true test, the culmination of the void's power. He raised his blade, shouting over the din of battle. Focus your attacks on the beast. Bring it down. The Seraphine warriors adjusted their formation, their weapons unleashing bursts of energy at the towering creature. The beast roared in defiance, its tendrils lashing out and tearing through the defenses. Kale dodged a massive swipe, rolling to the side and coming up in a defensive stance. He could feel the strain on the warriors around him, their energy waning as the battle dragged on. Just as the beast prepared to unleash another devastating attack, Kale felt a surge of power through his bond with Amara. Her presence flared bright in his mind, a beacon of strength and determination. The energy coursed through him, renewing his resolve. With a fierce battle cry, Kale charged toward the beast. He leapt onto its massive form, driving his blade into its thick hide. The creature roared in pain, thrashing wildly, but Kale held on, climbing higher and delivering blow after blow. The Seraphine warriors seized the opportunity, focusing their fire on the creature's exposed core. The beast let out a final, ear-splitting scream before collapsing, its massive form disintegrating into shadowy mist. The remaining void creatures hesitated, their cohesion faltering without their leader. Kale seized the moment. Push them back. This is our chance. The Seraphine warriors rallied, their attacks driving the swarm into a full retreat. The tide of battle shifted, and the void forces began to scatter, their forms dissolving into the jungle. As the last of the creatures fled, a heavy silence fell over the battlefield. The warriors stood in stunned disbelief, the weight of their victory slowly sinking in. Kale lowered his blade, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He turned his gaze toward the distant stronghold, where he knew Amara was still fighting. A sudden burst of light erupted from the ruins, illuminating the jungle in a brilliant glow. The energy was pure and radiant, a stark contrast to the void's oppressive darkness. Kale felt the bond with Amara surge, their connection stronger than ever. She had done it. They had won. Kale sank to his knees, relief washing over him like a tide. The war wasn't over, but for now Elithra was safe. And together, he and Amara had proven that their bond was unbreakable. The glow from the ancient stronghold faded, leaving the jungle in an eerie silence. The last remnants of the void had been driven back, their dark influence shattered. The Seraphine warriors gathered in the clearing, their weapons lowered, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and awe. For the first time in generations, the constant hum of the void's presence was gone. Kale stood amidst the warriors, his armor battered, his blade still in hand. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the stronghold's ruins stood against the backdrop of the jungle. The bond he shared with Amara pulsed steadily in his mind, a reassuring rhythm that told him she was alive, but the urgency of her presence suggested she wasn't done. Without hesitation, Kale turned to Alindra, who had led the reinforcements in his absence. Amara's still at the stronghold. I need to get to her. Alindra nodded, her respect for him now undeniable. Go. We'll secure the camp and tend to the wounded. Kale didn't wait for further permission. He sheathed his blade and sprinted toward the ruins, his muscles screaming in protest but his resolve unyielding. The jungle blurred around him, his focus entirely on the connection guiding him forward. The ruins loomed larger as he approached, the ancient stone glowing faintly under the moonlight. Kale slowed as he entered the main chamber, his breath catching at the sight before him. Amara stood at the center of a massive dais, her twin blades planted in the ground beside her. Her hands were raised, palms outstretched toward a swirling vortex of light that hovered above her. The energy crackled and pulsed, a mixture of golden warmth and lingering shadow. Amara, Kale called out, his voice echoing through the chamber. She turned at the sound of his voice, her face pale but determined. Kale, you made it. What is this? He asked, stepping closer, his eyes locked on the vortex. Amara's expression tightened. The core of the void's power. When we destroyed their leader, this was all that remained. If we leave it unchecked, it could grow again. Kale's jaw clenched. Then we destroy it. Amara shook her head. It's not that simple. This energy is intertwined with Elithra itself. If we destroy it recklessly, it could destabilize the entire planet. Kale felt a wave of frustration but quickly pushed it aside. Then what do we do? Amara hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment. The only way to contain it is to bind it to something, someone. It has to be controlled. Kale's heart sank as the implication hit him. You're not doing this alone. Amara met his eyes, her resolve clear. I can handle it, Kale. I'm connected to this planet in ways you're not. If I take the burden, Elithra will survive. Kale stepped forward, his hands gripping her shoulders. We face this together, Amara. We always have. The bond between them flared, their connection a steady pulse of unity and strength. Amara's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. Then we do it together, she said quietly. Kale nodded, his hands sliding down to clasp hers. What do we need to do? Amara turned back to the vortex, her grip on his hands tightening. We focus our bond, channel it into the core. It will stabilize the energy and seal the void's power within us. Kale didn't hesitate. Let's finish this. They stepped onto the dais, their hands still clasped. The vortex responded to their presence, its chaotic energy beginning to calm. Kale and Amara closed their eyes, focusing on the bond that had brought them this far. Their connection deepened, their thoughts and emotions merging into a singular force. The chamber filled with light as the vortex shrank, its energy condensing into a small, pulsating orb. Kale felt a surge of power flow through him, a warmth that countered the cold darkness of the void. Amara's presence was a constant alongside his, their unity forming an unbreakable barrier against the void's influence. As the last of the vortex's energy settled within the orb, the ruins trembled, and the glowing symbols etched into the walls began to fade. The air grew still, the oppressive weight of the void replaced by a serene calm. Kale and Amara opened their eyes, their breathing synchronized. The orb now floated between them, its light steady and contained. Amara reached out, her hand hovering over the orb. It's done, she said softly. Kale placed a hand over hers, their fingers brushing. We did it. The moment was broken by a low rumble as the ruins began to shift. The ancient structure its purpose fulfilled was collapsing. Kale and Amara exchanged a quick glance before sprinting toward the exit, the orb cradled carefully in Amara's hands. They emerged into the jungle just as the ruins caved in behind them, the sound of crumbling stone echoing through the night. The Seraphine warriors waiting nearby let out a collective cheer as Kale and Amara appeared, their victory now complete. Alindra approached, her expression one of relief and respect. The void's power is contained? Amara nodded, holding up the orb. It's sealed. Elithra is safe. Alindra placed a hand over her heart, bowing her head. You've done more than we could have ever hoped. Both of you. Kale glanced at Amara, a small smile tugging at his lips. We had a good team. As the warriors celebrated, Kale and Amara stepped aside, finding a quiet spot beneath the jungle's glowing canopy. The weight of their journey hung between them, but so did the unshakable bond they had forged. Amara turned to Kale, her expression soft. It's over. Kale shook his head. Not over, just different. She smiled, leaning into him. I can live with different. Kale wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. The bond between them pulsed warmly, a reminder of all they had endured and the strength they had found in each other. Together, they gazed at the twin moons of Elithra, their light casting a gentle glow over the jungle. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one.